Good morning, church. God is good, and all the time. Let's see if my tie is in line because I was sitting on tacks and jumping. Did you guys jump? I didn't see. Were you guys jumping along with those kids? No. Why not? It was wonderful to watch them and get all excited about the truth. And one of my favorite lines of that, Jimmy looked at me because he's like, oh man, that's one of the fast parts. I've got the wonderful love of my blessed Redeemer right down in the depths of my heart. Such a beautiful truth to be able to sing and to know that God is good all the time. He's with us all the time, in the good times and bad, and then in the mediocre times right in between, because He is our God, and His story is that He loves us. That's God's story, is He loves you immensely. He loves every aspect of you, and He's willing to send His one and only Son to be able to reclaim you, to take you from that story of sin that came into your life, because that's part of living in this world now after sin came into the world, and to redeem you as His own, to call you His daughter or His son, and it's a beautiful thing. For those of you that are visiting with us, we believe in Jesus. It's a blessing to have you here with us, and we hope that you know that we have the wonderful love of our blessed Redeemer right down in the depths of our hearts. And it's fun to say that too. I really enjoy saying it. For those of you that are live streaming along with us, welcome. It's a blessing to have you along with us as well. This past couple of weeks, we've been looking at the idea that we need to make good choices in our life because it's what causes us to live great stories. And so a story is a character who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it. And so what we looked at last week is how do we know what conflicts to actually engage in or not engage in? Because let's be honest, there are some other stories that are around us, for many different reasons, that try to get us to engage in conflicts that, we probably shouldn't have been engaging in. We probably should have been running from those conflicts because they weren't conflicts that were a part of our story. And some conflicts we've not been engaging in, we should have been engaging in because they are a part of our story. So the question we looked at last week was, how do you know what conflicts to engage with or what conflicts not to engage in? And I brought up the idea that it's probably about what you want. That helps give you the wisdom to know if you are going to engage in that. And so if we have the joy down in our hearts, and we're focused on what God's story is and want God's story, God's will, to be an aspect of our stories, I firmly believe with all my heart, we'll live better stories. We'll make better choices on those things that we're going to engage with and not engage in. So I want to continue that idea this week by looking at a Bible character that makes some really good decisions, engages some really difficult conflicts. And there's times where he doesn't engage them well. And he runs to some conflicts in a way where it wasn't even what God's will was. But overall, he does a fantastic job. And he tells us the reason why he does a fantastic job. And I love it. And he's not pompous about it. He says what his story was all about. And that's Joshua. Joshua is one of my heroes of the Bible. I look at him as an amazing leader and as an amazing man of God because he knew what he wanted the whole entire time. So what I want to look at this morning is this question, this idea of how did he know what he wanted to begin with? Joshua, if you have your Bibles, open up to Exodus chapter 17, verse 9. You can read this whole entire story a little bit later on today, sometime this week. But it's interesting to follow Joshua and his story. Joshua's story first comes into God's story, and we are introduced to him in Exodus chapter 17, verse 9. And here's what just happened. Moses got water from the rock. Let me rephrase that because that's what got Moses in trouble. God gave his people water from the rock. And the story just before that is he gave them manna. And just a couple of stories before that, he had them cross across the Red Sea and saved them from the Egyptians. And then he's been guiding them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. God has been with them, has been blessing them, been feeding them, been giving them water, and been taking care of them. Just before this, at the end of Exodus chapter 16, or I think it's the beginning of 17, but we find out that the Amalekites have decided that they're going to make war against God's people because God's people, they're numerous. There's over 2 million people going through this desert of Sinai, going through the wilderness, and they're fearful they're going to invade their land and take their resources. So the Amalekites attack. Moses knows he's going to trust in God and that God's been leading him. And what we find out is that God told Moses that as long as you have your arms up, that your people will win. And so what Moses does is he asks Aaron and this guy named Hur to help him out, to go up on the top of the mountain. But he asks Joshua to lead the Lord's army. Moses said to Joshua, "Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." And Joshua leads God's army, and he leads them through a victory because God led them through a victory. They kept, Aaron and Hur helped, they put a rock down for Moses, and Moses sits on it, and they hold up his arms. And as long as Moses' hands are up, there is victory. And Joshua is a part of that. He's the leader of the army at that time as he's going through that. Most of the time when we think about Joshua, we forget that he was the one that led the army of God in the wilderness. We usually think about him a little bit later on, such as in Exodus 24:13 or 33:11 or Numbers chapter 11 verse 28. All of these times Joshua attended Moses in Sinai and guarded both his tent and his position. And the most important one, I think, to help us understand the story of Joshua and how he knew what he wanted is this. In Exodus 24:13, it's perhaps the second time that Moses goes up on Mount Sinai. Now we know from context, from understanding, that he was there before. But what we find here is that he joins Moses in going up the mountain, at least partway. He goes with Moses a little bit of the way, and later on, Moses is up there on top of the mountain, and I'm sure Joshua was somewhere around. Do you remember the whole story why the people of Israel were so fearful of coming around the mountain? There was thunder and lightning and earthquake, and there was a whole bunch going on. It was like God was present, and his judgments were there, and they were fearful of the mountain. And God even told them that if any of your animals, if any of you touch the mountain, you will surely die. But yet Joshua went with him. And maybe he stayed at the foothill of the mountain. He stayed at the base of it, but he went with him. And this is the time that Moses gets to see the glory of the Father passing him by. And I bet you I know, Joshua was the first one to see the glory of God shining, radiating off of Moses' face after Moses got to see that. His story of knowing what he wanted continued to grow and continue to mature in that. And how I know that he saw Moses, he was the first one to be able to see that, is because as they're going down back to the camp, do you remember that first time that they came down from the mountain, that Aaron did that really dumb thing? Do you remember he got all the gold that the Egyptians gave them, all those earrings, all those bracelets, all that stuff? And he says that I threw the gold into the fire and out came this golden calf, which, by the way, we all know that was a lie. He had to shape that. They melted it, maybe they made a mold out of sand for it, and they put it in that fire and out came a calf is what happened because they did it. They built it. What Joshua says is it sounds like there's a war going on when he hears them worshiping that golden calf. He says, this doesn't sound right. And he was right. It wasn't the conflict that God would have them engage in. They were supposed to be at peace at that time. And instead, they were creating conflict as a result of that. But Joshua was there trusting the Lord the whole entire time because he was present and he noticed God's presence in his story and everything that was going on. At the end of Moses' story, Moses takes Joshua inside and says, all right, you're going to lead God's people now because God has set you aside. Oh, just before that, there's another story of reason why Joshua got called out to be the leader of God's people. Do you remember what that story is? They get close to the promised land, and Moses looks at the people and says, hey guys, we're going to go over there. Maybe we should find out a little bit about the land across the way. God says that we should find out. So how about 12 of you, one for each tribe of Israel, goes across and goes spy on the land. Do you remember when they came back what Joshua's story was and what the other 10, Joshua and Caleb's story were? And what the other 10 guys thought? They all came back and said, there's giants in this land. All 12 of them said that. But why was Joshua and Caleb's story different? They believed. The 10 came back with fear, saying, we can't go over there. They're surely going to destroy us. Even though it's a land flowing with milk and honey, and there's grapes that are they're giant. We had to take whole branches in order to carry these grapes. We can't go do this. But Joshua and Caleb spoke up and said, God has been with us. He has led us through the wilderness. He has taken care of us. We need to do this if this is God's will because it will work. This is a conflict we should engage in is essentially what they end up saying. And God blesses them because of it. And Joshua ends up becoming a leader of God's people, and Moses pulls him aside at the end of Deuteronomy, and I believe it's in Exodus as well, and says, be strong and courageous and don't be afraid, because God is always with you. Now, I believe that same phrase is true for you today. I believe God is always with you, but do you always believe that? Especially as you think about those conflicts that are hitting your life, those illnesses that come in, that cancer that family members or you have been struggling with. Maybe it's having financial issues at the time and wonder what's going on. Or even it's just the education. Right now I know a lot of you, because schools are coming to an end, you're worried about those tests that you're about to take. And teachers, you're worried about how your students are going to do. And all that stress of the world, all that stress of everything comes down on you. Do you remember that God is with you? Be strong and courageous. God's with you. You've got this. Trust in Him and engage in conflict well, that you might live a good story. Joshua was reminded over and over again of this truth in word as well as in action. He got to see God with them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He got to see the Shekinah glory of God every time Moses would go into the tent and he would come out after spending time with God. We find that Joshua was the one who really took care of him during those times. I wonder if it was a whole lot like when the high priest would go into the tent later on. They would make sure to have other priests nearby with ropes tied around the high priest's waist, just in case the glory of God was too much for them, that they would be able to pull him out, be able to save him. I bet you Joshua was there the whole time going, oh man, God is close. This is good. I wonder what's going to happen to Moses. Because Joshua believed and he had hope. He chose to live into conflicts well because he trusted God. God even begins his leadership story this way. And in Joshua chapter 1, you can read multiple times where God says, it's 3 times where God says, have I not commanded you to be strong and courageous? Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Now this morning in our class, we talked about this idea of freedom in God's will. And we struggle with that idea of freedom in God's will and what that means for us and how we live and make good choices to engage with conflict or not engage in conflicts that we should, according to choosing good story and knowing what it is that we want. And what you'll notice here in Joshua chapter 1, verse 9, and you'll notice through the whole story of Joshua, is that Joshua is free to choose. He's free to choose what he's going to do, the choices that he's going to make. And I hope that you notice as you read through the book of Joshua, and I challenge you this week, read the book of Joshua with your family. If you've already read through it by doing our day-by-day study Bible or reading Bible that we have for the kids, remember that green Bible? Go back and read it again this week. It's only a couple of days read. It's a blast. What I want you to notice is Joshua and God's people are free to choose. And the consequences of the choices of their freedom shows how good the story is going to be. And the story doesn't become easy because they choose God's will, God's way, but it does become better. It becomes worth it, and it becomes a great story to tell. So as you go through the book of Joshua, you're going to notice that there's times that people of Israel make bad choices, such as they're about to go to Ai. Do you remember that one, I think it was Achan, decided to go against God's will, and he stole stuff from Jericho after the walls fell down, and all of Israel was punished because of it. But they ended up becoming okay when they chose to do what God's will is, and to live into that truth. Or do you remember when that group of people, I forget what their names, and it'll come into me in a second, decided to dress up? They weren't Israelites. They decided to dress up like they've been traveling incredibly far. And I think it was the Jebusites. And they acted like they were traveling from really far. They made their clothes dirty and torn. They acted like they had really old stale bread and even put dust over their animals and did that. And they came. Do you remember what Joshua ended up doing? Before he remembered that God was with him, he ended up making a decision. He engaged a conflict, essentially. These people came to him and said, we're refugees, we've been traveling, we heard that God is with you, and we want to be here with you too. And without consulting God, he said, fine, you guys can come and be a part of what we're doing and who we are. And God said, don't you remember that the story is about us? That those conflicts you engage in, I'm willing to engage along with you. Why don't you talk to me about it? Is what God ends up telling Joshua. And Joshua learns from it and continues to grow. I'm sure part of the background conversation, if not God saying it, Joshua remembered it. He probably went, oh, that's right. Every single time as we went through Sinai, every time we didn't trust in you, it did fail. It did mess up. What was I thinking here? And he ends up being a blessed leader and living a fantastic story that we get to read today, because Joshua is a character that wanted to live according to God's will. And he chose to overcome conflict to live in God's will. And he overcame it boldly. At the end of Joshua chapter 24, we have this fantastic message that Joshua is basically mentoring his goodbye speech. He's telling the people of Israel, he's saying, all right, guys, you've got this. Continue to be God's people. Continue to stay strong because I'm leaving. It's the end of my days. I need to go home. Well, he doesn't say go home to the Father, but now we know that's what we do when we follow Jesus. And he says to them that it's going to be okay for you because we'll make a covenant that God has always been a God of covenant that has blessed you, and he's got this good land that he's promised for you. So he says this in Joshua chapter 24, verse 14. He says, now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. His first part of the speech is that your story should be engaging the conflicts of serving the Lord, of serving him with sincerity and faithfulness. But he recognizes the freedom that God has given his people to engage the story with, that they can make their own choice. So he then says this, put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river. And by the way, I believe that's beyond the Jordan. That's the whole entire trip that they've been going. It may be even a reference going back to the golden calf or all the way back to the gods that they may have thought about in Egypt. Gods beyond the river and in Egypt, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua knew what he wanted. He knew it clearly. He wanted to serve the Lord because the Lord has always been with him, even at times that he failed to remember that. God was with him and God was good. So Joshua says, and I love this version that's on the slide, but if it seems wrong in your opinion, and that's such a word we would use today, if it seems wrong in your opinion and your understanding of the truth and your freedom to engage God's creation, if it seems wrong in your opinion to serve the Lord, then choose today whom you will serve. Choose the gods whom your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now live. But my family and I will serve the Lord. He makes a promise for him and his family to live into the story of God's story, knowing that he has the freedom to choose that. I like this slide for us today. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Most of us in our houses, maybe not most of us, but I had this when I was growing up. I had this one room that I would come into my mom's house where we only sat in it when we had guests. And we only sat on those couches when we were clean. I'm getting a couple of amens over here. You guys know what I mean. And if you don't have that, then you probably got a mama that's like always making sure you keep your shoes off the couch, right? On the other couches that you have in your house. It's those couches where we meet together for celebrations and to talk about the good things that are going on in our lives. It's those couches where we meet together to talk about the brokenness and the loss that we're experiencing and the hurt and pain that is a part of this world. And maybe it's just that couch where we just share life and share story together and welcome people into our homes and greet them and share those stories that they have to share with us. Brothers and sisters, we have the freedom to choose if we're going to have this be over our homes, over those couches, over our dinner tables, over our beds as we go to sleep at night, over who we are as God's people. We have the freedom to choose if we're going to say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Because God's giving you that freedom. He downright loves you. And he wants you to love him in return. And so his will is not to be like, to take you and make you a robot and say, you are going to love me, you shall be my slave, and you shall always be in good relationship with me. Instead, God is a good father who, like the story of the prodigal son, was willing to give his son what he asked for, even though he knew it wasn't the best for him, because he wanted his son to have the freedom to choose to love him, with hopes of his return every single day. I love when Jesus tells that story of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15, because he tells of a father who goes to the road every single day to look for the return of his son that has had the freedom to choose to love him or not. And brothers and sisters, in a sense, God has given you that same freedom to choose to be his child or not. To choose to love him and to live into that story of wanting to know him and to be his child and to engage in the conflicts of the world that are going on now and engage in the celebrations as well and to disengage from the other conflicts that are distracting from that story of being his. You are his. He paid a price for you, but you have a choice. You have a choice if you're going to live into that truth, into that story, and in going to engage that. You don't necessarily have to put a vinyl sticker over your couches for that to be true. And let's be honest, sometimes those vinyl stickers call us out as hypocrites, don't they? I mean, you can read through the story of Joshua and you notice that he was a hypocrite every now and then, that he fell from engaging in that story of being strong and courageous and not being afraid because God is with him every single day. But yet we still have a choice, even in the midst of our hypocrisies, in the midst of our failures, to go, you know what? I will choose God. I will let him be over my house, and I will serve the Lord. To continue to live into that story, because the beautiful truth about God's story is that he will not turn his back on you. He's constantly there, waiting at the end of the drive, waiting for you to come home. And to let him be the father of your house. Let him be the God who is with you every single day. But as in every single story, you just have to choose if you're going to be strong and courageous and not be afraid. Because stories have elements that cause us to have fear in them. They have these things that go on that try to distract us, try to keep us from the actual path of the story. Many authors today are fantastic at doing that, because as you're reading through those stories, you're like, oh my goodness, so much is going on here. And then they bring you back to what the theme, what the overall purpose and goal of them telling you the story really was. And that's what God is doing in our lives. There are things that distract us, things that cause us to fail. But God sent his one and only Son to overcome all of our failures, that we may know that he never turns his back on us. So what are you going to choose? The only sin that's not forgiven is those that you don't ask for forgiveness of. It's turning your back on Jesus. It's not accepting the truth that he overcame all conflict for you. Are you willing to choose to say this and to pray this and to live this? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I pray that's true for you, and I pray that's true for me and my family. That we can live into these amazing stories that God is willing to live in with us, that we may be strong and courageous and not be afraid, realizing that God's there with us. Joshua's story is so amazing because, I'm going to be honest, I'm jealous of Joshua. And I've heard it said from many of you a couple times in our Bible classes that we're having. He got to see visible truth that God is there with him, with this pillar of cloud by day and this pillar of fire by night, and with manna raining down from heaven, and being able to have food every day, except for on the Sabbath, where they've already stored up enough for that. And these quail that would come and feed them meat, and this water that came out of rocks. And they got to see all of this stuff of God's action and God's story being true in reality for him. And I'll be honest, I'm slightly jealous of that, because I would like to see that same kind of stuff. But in my jealousy, I miss that God is doing not the same, because God's a good storyteller. He never really does the same thing multiple times. But God is doing things in the world today, in my life, where he's revealing his presence, revealing the truth that he is with me. And I believe he's doing that with you as well. There's so many stories that you, brothers and sisters, have shared with me that have helped me to realize this truth, that God is present in our lives. He never created everything and then walked away and just watched it. As Paul says in Colossians, he says that in Jesus all things hold together. And that Jesus really is God with us. So I want to encourage you, are you going to make the choice? Are you going to make the choice to keep praying this every single day and renewing this truth every single day, making this covenant, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord? Because it will bless your stories. And it will give you the strength to live with peace and comfort, engaging the conflicts that this world has for us to engage with until Jesus comes again. If you need to follow Jesus and haven't followed him, you need to follow him in faith and baptism. There's so much scripture that talks about this. And if you don't believe in that, come and talk to me about it. And we can go through the scripture and reason through why Jesus came to save us and why baptism is a part of following him and having faith in him. And if you need prayer for anything, we're going to stand and sing in just a moment. God answers prayers. God answers Joshua's prayers, and you can read about them in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy and Joshua. And we can still hear about God answering prayers with us together today. He's a God that loves our stories and wants to be a part of it and wants to hear about our stories. We need to pray together. I pray the Lord bless you and keep you, and the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. And I pray God turns his face to you and give you peace.